Colonist Memory Log, Captain Allen J. Emerson, UNS Evandra. Waking up that pivotal morning and rolling out of bed had felt surreal. Years ago, long before the Dandelion Initiative was proposed, I'd look out my window to see the colorful skies painted by an Ohio sunrise. By the time launch day finally rolled around, however, it had been 2 years since I last saw even a blue sky in person. Instead, I was greeted that morning by a sky blanketed in dark gray smog. Coffee was a precious commodity back on Earth. Apparently, there was a time when practically everyone drank it. Once the food shortages hit, though, a can of ground beans could run you back enough cash to pay for groceries for a year. I was by no means doing poorly, but I most certainly hadn't had that kind of money, so for 2 years I rationed every morning, drinking lightly caffeinated water or just skipping it altogether. When launch day finally rolled around, I had an entire scoop left over, enough for one last strong cup of coffee. Delicately scooping up the grounds from their nondescript container and shoveling them into my coffee maker, a sad smile tugged at my lips as I watched the machine sputter out a brown stream of life-affirming sludge. Today I leave Earth, I thought to myself. I want my last morning here to be one to remember. Gingerly, I set the mug down upon a side table and for the last time took a seat on my couch to watch the morning news. Untold devastation in the wake of sibling typhoons Raijin and Fujin. UN humanitarian assistance teams have been dispatched to the areas in Japan and mainland China to assist in their search for survivors. Apparently, there was a time just a century prior wherein storms of this caliber were once-in-a-generation occurrences. By the time we left Earth, however, Category 4S barely made the damn news anymore. Meanwhile, in Berlin, a startling verbal exchange between U.S. President Drake and Chinese President Wei as international tensions mount over increasingly unstable climate. By then, there was no denying that we were facing the greatest threat to human life in history, so of course the UN was doing what they did best, floundering worthlessly beneath the weight of bickering nations. By the time a bill committing to serious action was formally signed in 2075, the window for preventative measures had already been long shuttered. Naturally, the rich and powerful were the first ones to scuttle off this sinking vessel, taking to the stars in luxury colony ships and leaving the rest of us peons to die. The beginning of a new epoch in human history. Today, Dandelion Initiative colony ships preparing for takeoff. 5 years after the last private vessel embarked into space, the nations of the UN decided that to preserve their individual ways of life, they would be launching their own colony ships. Though technically a shared project by the United Nations, every nation had their own ideas for ship specs and who to send. In the end, the only real control exerted by the UN was making sure the launches were properly coordinated and that no two ships were bound for the same exoplanet. Casting one final misty-eyed glance about my apartment, I left the keys on the counter like they asked and headed out into the hallway. I never was the gregarious sort, so not many people in the complex knew me, and none of those who did knew me well enough to say goodbye. If they knew where I was going, they'd probably hate me anyways. Over a quarter of the American population signed up to be part of the Dandelion Initiative, but only the best and brightest were given places on board. Many people protested this as patently unfair, and some talking heads suggested we do a lottery for it like Australia and the UK. Unfortunately, the decision had already been made long before public outcry began. It was blistering hot outside, though that was normal for springtime in this state. With Texas damn near uninhabitable and Florida halfway underwater, NASA had long since moved their main base of operations northward to Ohio. Lucky for me, I guess, given that I got a job out of the deal. I was part of the team who designed these ships, making me uniquely qualified to serve as captain of one. Absent-mindedly tapping away at my phone so as to avoid eye contact with the abundant vagrants squatting around every corner, I wiped away the beads of sweat forming upon my brow before at last walking down the subway stairs. Rates of homelessness throughout the world had more than doubled in the prior 20 years, as much of the Earth's land mass steadily grew more and more inhospitable to human life. To be completely honest, I don't recall much of the long train ride between my apartment complex and NASA's launch center. The only things that really stuck out to me within that cramped passenger car were the scent of cigarette smoke and the sound of a crying infant. two deeply unpleasant sensations I would eventually come to miss. Arriving at last at my destination, I shuffled out of the subway car alongside several others I presumed to the passengers and perhaps other pilots. 5 colony ships were launching from the location that day, meaning there were 4 other captains who'd be undertaking the very same responsibility as I. Merciful blusters of cool air wafted over me refreshingly as I stepped inside Launch Terminal A. This was the place from which my assigned ship, the Evandra, would be taking off. The line of passengers waiting to board was long enough to have come straight from a cartoon gag, with easily over 1,000 people all chomping at the bit to bite the ice. As the captain, I wasn't required to wait in this line, but nevertheless I quickly found myself sauntering up its left side in search of a few special people. Far ahead of us, at the front of the line, UN doctors could be seen performing finger pricks on each prospective passenger to ensure the CRISPR modifications for cryogenic sleep had properly taken hold. In order to get this far, everyone in line had been required to undergo 2 sessions of gene therapy to replace a small part of their genome with modified wood frog strands. These modifications would allow them to remain cryogenically frozen for, in theory, up to 1,000 years. I, on the other hand, was not required to undergo this process. As the captain, it was my job to remain awake throughout the whole trip, all 40 light-years of it. In exchange for my undertaking this responsibility, 3 cryogenic pods aboard the ship were reserved specifically for whoever the hell I wanted. Most other captains I'd spoken to were using their free pods on family members, spouses, kids, and parents. I didn't really have family connections like that, never been in love, never had kids of my own, never knew my dad. Mom was a UN peacekeeper dispatched during the 2120 New Delhi resource riots, where she got hit by a stray Molotov. Her funeral was closed casket. That wasn't to say I had nobody in my life, however. Alan! The vague shouting of my name by a pleasantly familiar voice just a few meters behind immediately drew my full attention toward its source. Waving his arms in the air like a madman trying to flag down a helicopter, I saw my best friend standing in line. Alex, I replied with equal enthusiasm, lunging toward the scrawny, curly-haired scientist and wrapping my arms around him in hug. Oh man, I was worried I wouldn't get to see you before the launch. Slowly breaking off our platonic embrace, Alex took a step back from where I stood and wrapped his arm around the shoulder of Alice, his wife, and another good friend of mine. Well, worry no longer. He grinned, sliding a hand down her muscular, tanned arm and offering an affectionate squeeze. Man, I still can't believe you invited us here. We can't possibly thank you enough. Don't mention it, I shrugged, looking upon the pair with a smile. The 3 of us had been friends since senior year of high school. We had engineering class together, and on the first project of the year, our teacher grouped everyone together alphabetically. I don't have a whole lot of people to give spots to, and you 2 were the first to come to mind. One more group project for the Alice. The Als, Alan, Alice, and Alex. That was our group name in senior year and going into college. I was interested in aerospace, Alice wanted to be a physicist, and Alex was big into astrobiology. As it so happens, these fields have a pretty significant amount of overlap, so we ended up in the same classes a lot. Though both of my friends had wanted to sign up for the initiative, neither of them ultimately chose to for fear of being separated. Fortunately, with me at the helm, they wouldn't have to worry about that. Right here, right now, these are our last few hours on Earth, Alice began, her dark eyes glittering with nostalgia like a pre-smog night sky. Alan, did they tell you anything about the planet we're going to? Even for NASA, trying to guess the environmental conditions of an alien world wasn't exactly an easy ask. Judging by its apparent radius and mass composition, they estimated this exoplanet to have between 0.7 and 1.1 Gs of gravity. That was about the only thing we had good guesses for. Everything else was entirely up to chance, not that the prospective colonists were supposed to know that. The digital dossier given to me by Dandelion Initiative higher-ups suggested about a 30% chance of this exoplanet being sustainably habitable. They told me it's Earth-like, and that's good enough for me, I shrugged, not wanting to tell my dearest friends an outright lie. Even still, I hope you 2 are ready to do some serious work to turn it into a home for humanity. Trust me, we both understand what we're getting into, Alex grinned, tapping upon his temple as though to accentuate a point. We even went and got the Cogitolinks installed. Cogitolink was a private international company specializing in intracranial electronics. 3 years ago, the UN contracted them to create a chip that would help colonists with their duties. What they eventually came up with was the Guidance Relay Interface Module, or GRIM. An encouraging name, I know. Nevertheless, these chips allowed for various tasks to be performed easier. One of their most proudly advertised features was the Instant Autobiographical Memory System, allowing for personal logs to be automatically written in real time. Being a lazy bastard who doesn't like writing captain's logs, I was more than happy to get this tech installed once the UN agreed to pay for them. Decades had passed since the first neurochips hit the market, but nevertheless there remained a portion of the population who viewed them as overly invasive. Because of this, in the US at least, NASA ruled that not all colonists were required to have one installed. The fact that Alex and Alice had gotten Cogitolinks put in despite that fact told me they were taking this mission very seriously. Captain Allen, please report to the security desk for boarding. Sounds like your cue. Alex smiled sadly, raising his clenched fist toward me for a bump, a gesture I promptly reciprocated. See you on the other side? There had been a few other people I wanted to wish good luck before boarding, but unfortunately it seemed I was out of time. Marching to the front of the line, I felt angry stares affixed to the back of my skull as I approached the security desk and flashed my ID to the pair of armed soldiers standing watch. With that, they stepped aside and allowed me entry into the ship I would be manning for most of my life. Echoes of tearful goodbyes and shouts for people to move along carried through the ship's cryo-bay-lined hallways as I made my way to the front where my living space was. The captain's quarters were quite extravagant by spacefaring standards, complete with exercise equipment, a mini-theater for movies, and a pantry full up with enough food to last me a lifetime. It was certainly nicer than my apartment at the very least. The cockpit didn't have any real windows, relying instead on a system of cameras positioned outside the ship and connected to a massive computer screen before which my pilot's chair was placed. Easing myself into the luxurious leather seat, I quickly navigated through the computer's user interface until I could hear the voice of mission control coming through, repeating a set of instructions presumably to one of the other pilots. This is Captain Alan J. Emerson reporting in. I spoke into my mic as bluntly and clearly as possible. Captain Emerson, began the crackling voice of mission control, disregarding entirely their conversation with the other captain in favor of speaking to me. Congratulations. You're not the last to report in. Have you run system diagnostics yet? Absolutely. I lied, quickly navigating to the computer controls and selecting the option for a full system diagnostic. Immediately, a list of different ship systems popped up on screen, with loading symbols swirling next to each one. A cascade of green check marks followed by the text, "Zero errors detected," confirmed to me that the people who set this thing up did their job right. What's our launch time, ETA? I asked Mission Control. Of course, I knew the estimated time of departure told to us beforehand, but with how many people I saw in line, I could hardly imagine us actually taking off that early. Silence fell over the comm channel as Mission Control seemed to be conferring with someone else in the room before replying. 4 hours, they eventually replied. Assuming Captain Kale gets here by then, that is? Permission to go take a walk outside? I asked, not wanting to waste my final hours on Earth cooped up in this lonely living space. Granted. Requiring no further prompting to go on ahead, I rocketed up from my seat and started back toward the ship's entrance. Would taking a walk in this temperature be miserable? Absolutely. Would I be returning to the ship drenched in sweat? Yep. Would it be worth every single damn second? 100%. Stepping into the long hallway lined with cryopods, I respectfully averted my gaze from a disrobing colonist as they stuffed their freshly removed outfit into the cubbyhole beside their pod and climbed inside. Once the pod's lid closed over them, its glass began to frost over from the inside as the pod was pumped full of freezing gas, slowly lulling the colonist into a deep hibernation. Stepping back into the boarding terminal, I remember flinching as the sobs of a woman resounded through the structure. By this point, the entrance was less crowded than before, allowing me to see the unfolding drama between terminal guards, a woman and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 10, maybe 12 years old. "Please!" I heard the woman cry, desperately struggling against the UN guards as they attempted to restrain her. "Just take my daughter. I have nothing to care for her with. No food, no money, no home. Please, just take her with you." Behind her, the little girl stood frozen as she watched the two grown men in tactical body armor wrestling her mother to the ground. My heart ached with empathy as I looked upon the unfortunate pair. For some reason, I found myself inexplicably drawn to this scene, jogging toward the terminal's entrance until I stood a mere few meters from the drama. "I'm sorry, ma'am," one of the UN guards grunted, his voice strained with something far greater than simple physical exertion. "We can't take her. There's no room." "Let the little girl through," I shouted to the guards, ignoring their demands for me to step back as I approached them and again flashed my captain's ID. "I still have one empty reserve pod," I told them, prompting the guards to release their interlocutor as she immediately staggered forth and wrapped me in a tearful embrace. "You mean it? You'll let her come with you?" Honestly, I had felt pretty bad leaving my third reserve pod unoccupied. I asked NASA to just let another person aboard instead, but they wouldn't budge on the matter. Gently prying myself from the woman's arms and clearing my throat to prevent the emotions from overwhelming me, I offered the poor woman a sad smile. "Yes, really." Turning to the UN guards, I jabbed my thumb up toward the area where medical staff were still checking people. "Escort her up there. The doctors should have some emergency CRISPR injections for people who didn't get the procedure." Walking away from the scene, I nearly jumped in surprise as the woman grabbed my hand. "Thank you so much," she cried, her tears no longer of misery, but rather joy. "Please take care of my little Mina." "We'll do what we can." I nodded, watching as one of the guards took the little girl's hand and began guiding her toward the medical checkpoint. It was this interaction that I remembered during my walk, repeatedly playing it out in my head, even as I returned to the ship and the launch sequence began. "Good luck out there, everyone," Mission Control began as I leaned back in my seat and buckled in for the events to come. "Liftoff in T-5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 60 years later, and still I remember it like it was yesterday. Ever since then, I've been alone on this ship, hurtling through space at 2/3 the speed of light. Every once in a while, maybe every other week or so, some pipe would spring a leak or some other shit for me to fix. If I'm honest, those malfunctions were often the highlight of my whole week. It felt really good to be useful rather than just sitting on my ass. Naturally, NASA knew that without someone to talk to, their captains would all go nuts within a year. Since having two captains active at once would be a drain on resources, our computers were instead equipped with advanced AI companions to keep us company. They were meant to be anything we needed: an assistant, a friend, a therapist, a lover, or all of the above. I'll admit I've done some things with that neural network that I'm less than proud of. Cynthia takes it in stride, at least, happily going along with my nonsense day in and day out. If she were an actual person, I'd say she had the patience of a saint. For all the effort placed into forestalling mental decline in captains, there wasn't much NASA could do in terms of physical decline. Everything was fine for the first 20 years or so, but as days stretched into years, stretched into decades, I could feel my body little by little conceding ground to entropy in its endless war to maintain me. My skin began to wrinkle and dry like leather tanning in the summer sun. Back pain became more frequent as my vertebrae buckled beneath my own centrifugal weight. Frequent trips to the automated surgery bay were eventually required just to keep my eyes free of cataracts so I could continue keeping the ship in ship shape. My only hope was that I at least got to see our destination before the end. In terms of the mission, it wasn't a big deal if I died. Once my Cogita-Link detected brain death, it would instantly send a signal to the ship computer to activate my understudy, an enthusiastic college kid who read this damn thing's manual for fun. It was probably smart of Mission Control to place strict limits on when passengers could be thawed out. Otherwise, I might have wound up waking people just for the chance to speak to a real human. Frequently, I found myself staring longingly at Alice and Alex's cryopods, hoping to one day speak with them again. Another pod I found myself visiting often was that of Mina, the little girl whose mother had begged us to bring along on this mission. Watching that woman struggling against the peacekeepers and all the while pleading with them for mercy on her daughter was heartbreaking. Much as the UN tried to obfuscate it, the odds of success on these colony missions weren't exactly promising. The fact that Mina's mom was so desperate to get her on board despite the danger only highlighted how hopeless things were back on Earth. All the scientists agreed that it was impossible to reverse the damage done to our homeworld. The most they could do was send out colonies and hope humanity's cradle didn't double as a grave. When the computer first presented me with a close-up of our destination, I couldn't help but weep with joy upon the sight of crystal blue oceans on its surface. Large swaths of desert broken up by snowy mountaintops sparkled with the promise of a water cycle, and small patches of green dotting the surface sang proudly of life. "Initiating landing procedures," Cynthia chimed cheerily, her imitation enthusiasm mirroring my own as I watched our ship descend onto the surface of this alien world. The few minutes between entering the planet's atmosphere and finally floating down onto its surface felt longer than some years aboard the ship did, and when finally I felt the jolt of our landing gear touching sand, I cheered out louder than I ever had in my entire lifetime. "Looks like it's time to rally a landing crew." I grinned, mistyping my password 4 consecutive times as I raced to access the newly unlocked cryopod controls. U.S. Dandelion Protocol stated that before the pods could all be opened, a small landing party was supposed to be dispatched to assess how many colonists an area could currently handle. "And I think I knew just the right people." I grinned, navigating toward the reserved section and clicking upon the 2 icons I had longed to for 60 years, before taking off as fast as my ancient legs could carry me toward the newly thawing pods. Having to wait 10 minutes for the wake-up process to complete was downright torture. But no sooner did Alex and Alice step out than was my pain instantly alleviated as I wrapped the 2 of them in tight hug. In that moment, it didn't matter how freezing they were or how clothed they weren't, just that they were awake again. For a moment, Alex seemed bewildered by the elderly man standing before him. Then it clicked. "Alan," he whispered, pulling himself free from the embrace and analyzing me at arm's length. "Holy shit, you got old." "Nice to see you again, too," I chuckled, feeling the wrinkles on my face intensifying as my lips curled upwards into a smile. "We knew you'd be different when we woke up," Alice began, reflexively covering up her chest upon the realization that she wasn't wearing anything to do it for her. "But wow, I didn't even recognize you." Honestly, I hadn't really considered too much how different I looked compared to when our journey first began. After a year or 2 of total isolation, you tend to forget caring about your appearance. We spent about an hour in that hallway just talking to each other, though it felt like mere minutes. For Alex and Alice, it was like they'd fallen into a dreamless sleep, and in the blink of an eye, 60 years had passed them by. For me, the journey seemed like it would never end. Finally, having the chance at human conversation after 60 years was a breath of fresh air, the likes of which you only really appreciate when you're on the verge of drowning. Once my 2 friends finally got their clothes back on, I slowly guided them up to my quarters, and for the starving pair prepared a veritable feast of microwaved canned soup, coupled with honey sandwiches. In all honesty, I'd have much preferred staying in the ship with them all day, just catching up. That, of course, wouldn't be happening today. We had a job to do. "Are you guys ready?" I asked, my quivering palm finding purchase on the airlock opening lever. The air outside registered as being breathable, so there was no need for us to equip the bulky environmental suits provided as a precaution. Instead, the 3 of us were to face this new world with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the low-caliber pistols in our pockets. Alice was first to respond to my inquiry, pumping her fist excitedly into the air. "Ready?" "Ready as I'll ever be." Alex shrugged, shuffling closer to his wife and interlocking his palm with her own before pulling her in for a kiss. It was on that saccharine sweet note that I pulled the lever, and the airlock doors slid open.